This is Flipping the Tables. I'm Colleen Shaddix. Today we're joined by Lincoln Rice, who's coordinator of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee.
War tax resistance is essentially a practice of um, trying, sometimes I'd just say it's even trying to refuse to pay federal income taxes that are used for military purposes with the intent to kill people. It has a long history. It seems if we have enough information about a civilization, we can find instances of people trying to refuse to pay certain kinds of taxes for military purposes. And we see it as an extension of conscientious objector status. So that is a right that is recognized in the United States, that if you don't believe in murdering people, it goes against some philosophical or religious belief. You won't be forced into that type of military service. And war tax resistance is more of a logical extension. If I wouldn't participate in those types of activities myself, then why would I pay significant amounts of money to have other people do it for me?
So, for most people, that will come down to federal income tax.
Yes, in the United States, it's more federal income tax, though it can be more, in practice, it's more federal income tax, um, though it can also include things when we know certain tariffs are in place. There's definitely been an emphasis during this administration, but also during other administrations to increase tariffs as a way to um, not raise federal income taxes so much, but with the same
Hmm.
purpose and the same types of things. So I know during the first Trump administration, some people tried to limit the amount of goods that they bought from China because at that during the first administration, that's where the highest tariffs were being exacted.
So, practically, how does it work to refuse to pay your income tax?
Sure. So there's kind of two large umbrellas. The legal one is you don't make enough money to owe federal income taxes, or you have enough deductions or tax credits or whatever, however you can work it in your own situation. That's a more common situation for people that are more simple living or people who live in community like Catholic worker types. Um, though there are other people that, make it work in their own types of situations and you know kind of the standard number is you make less than the standard deduction for your filing status. So if you're single, that's about $16,000. And if you're married, it's around $32,000. But like I said, you could potentially make more and have deductions that could allow you to have no taxable income. For others, it's they make more than that. They owe something at the end of the year. And depending on more their life philosophy and what they're willing to risk and all those sorts of variables. It could be that they say, well, anything I pay is going to be, some of it's going to be used for the military, so I'm going to refuse to pay all of it and just redirect it somewhere else to people who are doing good work or people who are in great need. For others, it might be, well, usually it's about 50% of the federal budget's used for the military purposes, so I'm just going to withhold 50%. And for others, it might be just I want to do something that's lower risk, but still want to send a message. So I'm going to resist $500, something that I'll still get letters about, but the federal government probably really won't care and nothing is probably going to
Mhm.
happen. I know following 9/11, it was common for a lot of folks who did that sort of, we called it symbolic resistance. So it was still actually resisting something and actually breaking the law. They often were resisting maybe $9.11 or $911 because they saw this continuing, unending war in response to September 11th.
So, if we talk about that first group of people, people who are keeping their income purposefully low, um, they are rejecting capitalism. They're rejecting the American system, right? Where the goal is to make as much as you can and buy as much as you can. Talk about the connections between rejecting materialism and rejecting war.
Yeah, so I think there's, going back to those triplets of Martin Luther King Jr. of war, racism, and poverty. He very blatantly made those connections later on in his, in his work that part of the reason that poverty exists to the degree that it exists in the United States is because of the large amount of resources that we dedicate toward war making. And if we would decrease that budget, if we would stop the war in Vietnam in that particular instance, we could really fund the war, at that time in the 60s, the war on poverty, which did make huge strides in alleviating poverty during the 1960s, but could have done a lot more if it weren't for the war in Vietnam. And so there are definitely many war tax resistors see that connection. For others who practice more of this simple living type of resistance, it might have religious motivations of trying to emulate the life of Christ or St. Francis of Assisi, or just a belief that living more simply is um, more in tune with their religious values. But for other folks, or it could also be an additional reason, there are definitely environmental factors like lessening our carbon footprint. And, and that war definitely increases our carbon footprint substantially. The Pentagon's the number one user of oil in the world, yet in all these different climate accords that the US in the past has been a part of, even when we were a part of them, it never had any effect, or it always excluded any effect on the military because that was seen as national, for reasons of national security. But there's definitely people who their war tax resistance goes hand in hand with their desire to combat the climate crisis.
Talk a little bit about how your own faith connects to this work for you.
Yes. So for myself, I came across war tax resistance because of my participation in the Catholic worker movement. So back in the early 90s is when I first came across Dorothy Day's writing when I was in high school, and in the late 90s, joined a Catholic worker community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I'm still located, called Casa Maria. And there were people who, lived simply, who were war tax resistors. And for the organization that I'm the coordinator now for, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, they had all of their resources on the bookshelf. So it made it really easy to make, I wouldn't say that's always the case at every Catholic worker. But for me, Dorothy Day's writings herself, the founder of the Catholic worker who's currently, whose cause for canonization is before the Vatican. Um, she wrote openly about her war tax resistance, and that definitely left an effect on me. And I knew about that, at least on her written page, before I came to the Catholic worker movement and started participating with it myself. And so then to actually meet people who are doing it now, who had the resources of how other people did it who actually made more than the taxable income limit. It all just seemed to me to fit together. And I can't separate my war tax resistance from my faith journey and my connections to the Catholic worker movement.
And how does it specifically play into the gospel message?
Hmm. Well, I think I always think of, I'm not exactly sure who came up with this, but there's always been this graphic that you often see at Catholic worker houses where it'll list on one side the works of mercy and it'll list on the other side the works of war. So I'm not sure if Dorothy or who came up with this works of war list, but it really brought out for me the notion of that parable from Matthew 25, where all the nations of the world are gathered together. And it seems like, based on the context, that not necessarily always as individuals, but maybe as communities or nations, they're going to be judged on how they did these works of mercy, of feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting the prisoner, sheltering the homeless, taking care of the sick. And so it was somehow within the Catholic worker movement that the insight came to be that if this is how we're going to be judged, then how much worse would it be if we're doing the exact opposite of those sorts
Mhm.
of things? And so the works of war is what came out of there, which would be destroying people's crops, destroying their food supplies, bombing their water filtration plants so that you're poisoning their water, putting people in prison as political prisoners. So all these sorts of things, even though in certain passages maybe they're not always explicit, but in Jesus's ministry of inclusion, and in those list of the works of mercy, just to point out two things, I think they're extremely implicit and they're just the foundation, I think, for gospel living, which goes against the works of war.
It's interesting. I remember many years ago talking to a great Catholic worker, Tom Cornell, um, who was talking about the sinfulness of all the things our nation does.
Mhm.
And I pushed back and said, I don't feel guilty about that, Tom. Everything you're talking about, I have protested. I have actively tried to make it not happen. And he said, but you still benefit.
Hmm.
So do you feel that and he likened it to original sin, like
Hmm.
it's just there. Do you feel that you in some way disentangle yourself from this horrible war machine that we've made?
Uh, to a small degree. I know, even to give an example, because I'll redirect the small amount that I owe every year that I'm refusing to pay, but there are groups that'll get together and redirect on a larger scale. So,
Hmm.
for instance, in the Boston area, there's a New England War Tax Resistance, and they'll offer grants to local justice and peace and people addressing issues of poverty and racism. They'll have all these grants available, and they redirected, I want to say, around $80,000 this tax day to local groups. And when I think about that, I'm like, oh wow, that's more than the budget of our local Catholic worker for in a year. Like that's a significant amount of money. But if you're talking about a warplane, that's like, I don't even know if that's less than a wing.
Right,
So the amount resisted, in one sense, even all the war tax resistors doing this together, let's just say it's even $500,000, or maybe it's even $1 million. In the grand scheme of things, it's not, at least at this point, not affecting the federal budget for the military. But I do think it gets noticed. I think it does send a message. And for the groups who are recipients of these funds, it's definitely a huge help. So, in that sense, I do feel it's trying to address some of the wounds that are being created by our current federal budget, though it's just a piece. And
hmm,
I pay the gas tax every time I fill up my vehicle. I imbibe alcohol from time to time, and so I pay the alcohol tax. And there are definitely different taxes when I purchase items that I need for the household or at the Catholic worker. Sometimes there's not other options to buy things than items that are coming from different countries where there's going to be a tax on that just to be imported into the countries with tariffs. So it's definitely, I'm not under any illusions that I've withdrawn myself from the system, but at least trying to do something to address it is voice that I'm not okay with it.
you mentioned that conscientious objection is recognized as a legal right, but tax resistance is not. Is there any effort to change that?
There is, there is. I must admit, our group doesn't really work on that, but there is a group located in Washington, D.C. called the National Campaign for a Peace Tax Fund. And I don't recall how long they've been around, but they've been around for many decades. And, essentially their work is to try to expand that right.
Hmm.
In more recent years, they actually added the religious part to it because they know the Supreme Court and some Republicans have been more friendly to expanding rights based on a religious basis.
Hmm.
I don't see this passing in any time in the foreseeable future, but it is something that many war tax resistors do support and try to use it as a tool when they're speaking to their representatives. And the person who had been the longest time sponsor of the bill was John Lewis, the civil rights leader who recently passed away. So it was something, it was a way to it was a, you know, kind of a fascinating way that by supporting that, it was also connecting a bit to his work and legacy.
There are people who go above the income limit, who legally have a tax obligation, who don't pay it because they don't believe it's right. What does the government do to them?
It largely depends on how much they owe. The percentage you're withholding doesn't really make a difference. But the number one thing that, especially if someone's actually filing, there are those who won't file and might fall through the cracks. For those who file, they'll definitely get letters, and you'll get the same threatening letters whether you refuse to pay $1 or $10 million. It's an
Mhm.
automated letter making system. But it's more if you start owing around, let's say $25,000 when you add in and that could be multiple years and penalties and interest. Once the total amount is about 25,000, then you're more likely, it's still definitely no guarantee, but they might eventually garnish wages or go after a bank account or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, in 2018, a new law went into effect where if you have a tax debt that they consider um, extremely delinquent, which it goes up every year with inflation, but this year I believe it's around $65,000. Once you reach that amount, they won't allow you to renew your passport or to get a new one. So that's a bigger deal for a lot of folks who want to have the option to leave the country. So some people have chosen to resist smaller amounts, like maybe $2,000 or $3,000 a year, knowing that if they resist every year, they'll never actually make it up to that amount. Because there's also a 10-year statute of limitations for filers. Like after 10 years, they
Mhm.
can't go after the older amounts anymore. But it really, there's also, I should mention, there's in the IRS, there's a civil division and a criminal division. And so the civil division is the one that tries to do this collection. They've been grossly underfunded for the last 20 years. They got a little bit more money under Biden, but it was all stripped away and then some under this Trump administration. So right now, the IRS is really just struggling to keep the tax code up to date, process tax returns, answer the phone, and they don't have that. Like they definitely are doing some collection, but nothing like they used to. Like if this was the 80s, I would say if you have a wage job, you are almost guaranteed within a few years to be garnished.
Mm.
I had, before I started doing consultant work for NewTrack, I had a wage job for close to 20 years and I was never garnished. I never had a bank account levied. So it's definitely not a guarantee anymore. But again, the more you owe, the more, the greater chance that you might be one of the people chosen by their algorithm. In the last 30 years, really the only people who have faced the criminal division and criminal charges and possible or sometimes actual jail time are those that chose to file, but then when they filed, they practiced what we would call tax fraud. They purposely left out large amounts of income or they took deductions that they knew they were not legally allowed to take. So
Mhm.
in the last 30 plus years, those war tax resistors who have filed and filed accurately have not faced any criminal prosecution. Though it is against the law and they could face criminal
Mhm.
prosecution, but it has not been the practice of the IRS to do so.
Does doing war tax resistance generally move people into doing other piece work as well?
That's a good question. I feel like for a lot of war tax resistors, they're already involved in peace work or justice work, and this, I think, just becomes another piece of what they do. I'm
Hmm.
trying to think if I know anyone who became a war tax resistor who I should take that. There definitely are folks, I don't say especially during these last, since we've seen an exponential increase in interest and practice of war tax resistance since the invasion of Gaza. So
Mm.
before the invasion of Gaza, most of the people I knew were involved in some form of peace work on varying scales. But now, especially under Trump, also, but with Gaza, there are people who weren't necessarily activists at all, but were just saw the TV, saw what was happening in Gaza, mostly funded with US weapons, and are like, I just cannot pay for this. I'm sure some of them it also led them to go to their first protests or maybe anti-King days now during the Trump administration. But there's also a large amount of people under Trump that, are doing it because they feel Trump's doing things that are, that are not constitutional. but they also see the threats against Greenland. They see what happened in Iran, and so it's definitely, I'd say these last 3 years or so, it's been a mix where I think a lot of the people who are starting to do it now might not previously have any connection to any peace and justice movements.
That's interesting. You know, the genocide in Gaza is just so horrifically evil, but I think it's important to talk about like just how much violence is our military perpetrating around the world at all points in history.
Yeah, and so I think the genocide in Gaza maybe attracted a large, I'll say, a new wave of resistors. I'd say for two reasons. One is that it was actually covered on television, where a
Mm,
lot of the other things that we know about that are happening all over the world at any given time are rarely ever covered, especially during the Trump administration. Also, even during the Obama administration. During Obama, we saw this huge increase in the use of drones to kill people all over the world. The media never covered it. Maybe the peace media, the peace and justice media, but never the regular media. And
yes.
with Trump, he says something so crazy every day that it usually, except for the war in Iran, which obviously is a huge drain on resources and is causing a huge increase in gas prices and other prices. So it's come a bit more to the forefront. But so there's one that these things are actually in the news, the genocide and the war in Iran, and then also that it's not U.S. troops. I think in the past, when like during the war on terror, we saw an increase in war tax resistance then, but I don't think it's anything compared to what we're seeing right now. And I think there's always this notion, well, I don't like what we're doing, but I don't want to be, I don't want to, I want to support the troops because they're putting their lives on the line. But our troops really aren't involved, especially with the war in Gaza. And with the war in Iran, it's been mostly a drone warfare. There haven't been any boots on the ground. And so it's, again, something where it feels removed, like you can be against it without necessarily
Mm.
being against the troops, or at least our troops.
It's interesting. I mean, I always think even in situations where there are people on the ground, like supporting the troops, bringing them home is a great way to support them. It doesn't mean that I'm against Corporal Smith. I'm against the situation that he's been put in.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in your take on the renaming of the Department of Defense into the Department of War. What do you think about that?
It seems honest. So that part's good. Um, because otherwise, I don't think anything's really changed at the Department of War, or the Department of Defense. It does the exact same things it did before, but now they're just honest about it. And obviously, as we know, that was its original name. It was only much later on when they wanted to make it look like we weren't emphasizing war so much that it became the Department of Defense.
As far as you know, is it just weapons and war making that people practice tax resistance on? I mean, I certainly don't want to be funding prisons, any number of things that our government does.
I mean, I think that's the main touchstone. Though I'll say there was a large, I feel like there have been just these building waves since Gaza. And
Mhm.
and this tax season was even the busiest tax season yet in terms of phone calls, visits to our websites, things that we could measure. We saw substantial increases even over the last 3 years. And um, but one of those waves was because of ice. So, you know, whether ice counts as the military, some people it's a grayer area when you start talking about kind of internal policing,
Hmm.
which some people would clearly, I think, make good arguments for, are clearly a version of military occupation. Um, but for instance, there was Rachel Cohen. She gained some prominence as a Chicago lawyer who resisted the around $8,000 that she owed in federal income taxes this spring. And you know, I think now she's always maybe said, oh, well, ICE and the war in Iran, but her first
Hmm.
video that went up was right before the war in Iran. So her kind of main impetus for war tax resistance was because she was involved with protests and supporting protests against the actions of ICE in Chicago. And she just thought, if I'm willing to be out here and be arrested for this, why am I paying for it? Like, why am I afraid to stop paying for it
Hmm.
if I'm already willing to risk arrest? And so for her, that was her touchstone. But I'd say for a lot of folks, it was also. And I guess I always say, I don't know if you can always choose one reason, but I'll say every time I get a phone call, it's usually someone who says, this latest thing that happened is the last straw. Everything's
Hmm.
been building for a long time, and now they're just like, I've been thinking about this, and this last thing that happened is now the line is in the sand, and I can't cross this line anymore by paying federal income taxes.
I know the Catholic worker has always been prophetic about peace, but our parishes, the church as most Roman Catholics
Mhm.
know it, what should we be doing to bring about peace in the world?
Uh, that's a good question. It's that's a great question because there's just so much that needs to change. And um, it'd be great if every parish had a peace and justice committee, or maybe each parish had in the United States at least had uh, a reading group on anti-racism materials, or but there's for so many folks, even though we're, many decades long, after Vatican II, there's still this notion of pay, pray, and obey,
Yeah.
where, you go to church on Sunday and maybe you go to confession once a year. And other than that, it's not always seen that there's an effect that spills over into your daily life, or how to live in the world, or how to, if this should affect how you view public policy. And so just we're still stuck in this mode where religion as a whole in the United States is seen as a very individualistic type of thing that doesn't have social implications. And I don't know. That's a big question, and yeah, there's just a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure where to begin. Other
It's
than
kind of
I
the
think it's
question.
yeah, I think anywhere that people can move parishes, or you know religious education programs into that space. I think it's one of those things that it needs to be happening from lots of places all at once to help try to move this big, organism.
It can be disheartening because religion is seen as socially relevant to people who are in favor of military spending
Mm,
and, bullying trans kids about where they use the bathroom and so forth. And I wonder why more progressive, though I don't really want to make it a right left split, but more compassionate public Christianity doesn't stand up and be counted.
yeah, I mean, I think it does come down to that individualistic notion, especially maybe with those who are more left leaning, but maybe, aren't activists or Catholic workers, or, there's just this thought, and maybe even for people who are maybe a little to the right, maybe it's more people that are on the further to the right or further to the left who are, more of, well, this has implications. The church needs to be lobbying on abortion, or the church needs to be lobbying on war or the economy. But I'd say it seems like the the great amount of Christians or Catholics in the more of the center area. It's just a personal thing that they do, and it's not something that has greater implications outside of their private life or maybe their family.
You have answered all my questions, but I never like to end an interview without asking, is there something you wanted to say that I didn't give you a chance to say?
Sure. I would just, if anyone is thinking about war tax resistance, just say, please go to our website. Just Google war tax resistance will be the first thing that comes up. And our website is probably one of the largest websites you'll have ever visited, outside of something like Amazon or eBay. Except for, it's just full of so much information because there's so many different types of situations, or people who are married or not married, or are thinking about what if they're going to buy a home, or what if all these questions, they're all on our website. And but in it, so just it can be a little overwhelming at first, but just on our front page of the website, there's also the only video posted up there is a 101 video, and it kind of goes through all the basics. It'll answer any kind of almost any questions you probably already have, and then create new questions that you didn't even know that you should be thinking about. But I just say, just take some time, wade in that water, and and then we have lots of resources too, where we have at the end of that video, it'll show where on our website, if you wanted to connect with what we call a local war tax resistance counselor, you could touch base with someone locally who's doing this, who'd be willing to kind of talk through different options and see if there's something that you're comfortable with. So, um, but yeah, it's I just we want to make sure that anyone who's thinking about doing it before they would actually do it knows exactly what they're getting into. We don't want anyone to think about, well, I'm going to do this and I guess I'll see what happens. Like we want people to know, like, this, if you do this, there still is uncertainty because the IRS goes after so few people, but at least you know what the possibilities would be
Right.
and what type of risks you're taking.
Well, that's great. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you, Colleen.